Thank you for the invitation. Thrilled to think that there are participants from as far afield as Texas. That's a first for me, certainly. I'm sorry about the fact, well, I sort of apologize that you can't see me. You can see David. We moved back to Surrey, 25 miles south of the centre of London 3 months ago. And I can assure you that internet connections and quality are infinitely better in rural North Down than they are 25 miles from London. It's crazy. So it's as simple as that the technology couldn't cope, I'm afraid, with my trying to be on camera as well as giving the talk and showing this. So thank you very much. I produced this book. Well, it was really a retirement project for me in 2011. And then I worked with two colleagues at it who helped quite a bit with the research, Deirdre Wildy in Special Collections at Queen's University Belfast. They formally published it last summer, and we had a lovely launch at the end of September. And another colleague, Carolyn Cooper, who, like me, had lived in China for a number of years, but she did so more recently than myself and was more up to date with pinyin as opposed to the Wade Giles romanization, for example. So I was very grateful to them to help me produce it, but responsibility for any errors is mine alone. The book has on the front cover Robert Hart there, and I'll show you that in a bigger picture in a second. And on the right is a lovely ukiyo-e painting by Hiroshige Utagawa. It's the first train arriving at Yokohama Harbour Station from Tokyo in 1871. And of course, railways were one of the issues in both the modernization or not in China and Japan in the mid and latter part of the 19th century. That's the sort of painting in rather closer detail by Frank McKelvey, posthumously from a photograph of Sir Robert Hart, still hangs in the Great Hall at Queen's. I'm not going to talk only about Hart because I know a number of you are very familiar with his story, but I hope, thanks to material at Queen's University, for example, that you won't have access of, there'll be a certain amount of new material I'll share with you about Hart and his family, including some photographs, and then we'll talk about a couple of other interesting families, the Edgars and the Ensors, towards the end of the talk. Robert Hart was born in 1835. This is from an archive I was lucky enough to start having access to in Hollywood, County Down, a couple of years ago. It's fascinating. There was a man there who set up the soap factory in Belfast, Alexander Finlay, who travelled abroad, and this was in his personal collection. I just love it to think that as long ago as October 1850, a man in Hollywood with no Chinese connections was so fascinated in the exotic East. And this was the very first account of a visit by the British Royal Navy to the east end of the Great Wall of China in the north there, and a long description of that visit there. That he kept it, and still 150, 70 years on, it's still accessible in the archive. Robert Hart had somewhat humble beginnings, as many of you will know. His father was a whiskey distiller initially. Robert was born in 1835 when the railway came to Portadown. The station subsequently moved from Watson Street to Woodhouse Street, where Robert was born. And of course, the family moved around a little bit to Milltown when he was a young boy, and to Craigavon. His father was still, as Irish Presbyterian at this point, still involved in whiskey distilling as a manager. There was then a disaster at Craigavon when the distillery burnt. And then in 1855, actually the year after Hart went out to China, his parents moved to Ravarnet House, which is a lovely house that I visited on the outskirts of Hillsborough. And this man, Henry, his father, subsequently became a mill owner there, and really quite wealthy. And just where the money came from, I'm not entirely sure. It's never really been satisfactorily, I think, discussed. But I think there's a lot of evidence that the Edgar family, very prominent Portadown family, as you will know. And that was Anne. Her brother Richard was the postmaster in Portadown, played a large part in bringing the railway to Portadown. And of course, they owned the Mandeville Arms. And I think they were a wealthy family. They gave their name to Edgarstown. And I think probably somewhere along the line, some funds flowed to Henry Hart that enabled him to become somewhat more, frankly, sort of middle class. And of course, it was by that time, by the 1850s, that Robert and Anne had become staunch Wesleyan Methodists. And they sent young Robert off to Wesleyan School, initially in Taunton, where he travelled between Northern Ireland and the port in Lancashire on the Shamrock sailing vessel. And then he was due to come back from Taunton, and he was let down by his Belfast teacher who was there. And at the age of 10 or 11, young Robert found his way from darkest Somerset up to Liverpool and back on the boat. And Henry was so appalled that he then sent him to the Wesleyan Connectional School in Dublin, which had been set up, interestingly, by a group of Belfast Methodists. And again, I slightly wonder why they chose Dublin rather than Belfast at that time, but clearly they felt there was a better prospect for getting a school established in Dublin. Robert did well academically from a not very promising background. He went to Queen's University at the age of just 15, which was unusual, but not absolutely exceptional. He graduated at the age of 18, going on 19, and quite by chance in that year, 1853, 1854, the Earl of Clarendon, who was the Foreign Secretary briefly after Palmerston, decided that he would open the competition to one graduate from each of the four Royal Universities in Ireland at that time, Dublin, Galway, Cork and Belfast. And Robert Hart put himself forward as the Queen's University nominee, and he was put forward. And he travelled out to Hong Kong initially in 1854, arriving there in the summer. And I will dwell on this lovely painting for a moment. We know it's dated 1854. We know that it was painted by an unnamed Chinese artist, might well have been taught by the fascinating man with Irish connections, George Chinnery, who's buried in Macau. And when I was seconded to the Hong Kong government for 3 years to work for the Hong Kong government in 1980, and I had bare walls in my rather small flat, and I went to the Urban Council and looked to see what prints I could purchase there, and that was one of the prints that I purchased in 1980 to put up frame and put up on my walls. And I subsequently realized that that was this lovely painting in 1854. So that is exactly the scene that Robert Hart would have seen as he arrived in summer 1854 in Hong Kong Harbour. It's the peak on the right-hand side, and you can see some dwellings there in the foreground, and the government house where the governor lived is a little way above the others. Hart only spent a couple of months or so initially in Hong Kong. He met the governor, John Bowring, who told him to learn Chinese, which was very important and good advice. Robert Hart had gone out to join the British consular service in China. There were only a handful of candidates each year who went out there, and it was a pretty lonely and a pretty challenging posting. Briefly, the background to that is, and certainly for English audiences, forgive me if you're all familiar with this, but I find English audiences to whom I give a talk are less familiar with the depredations of the East India Company and some of the things that we got up to in what we would have called the Far East in the 1830s and 1840s than a sophisticated Craigavon audiences. But of course, the British East India Company was hugely wealthy by the turn of the century. That's the 1790s, 1800s. And one of the local men, Francis Turnley, who was son of a Newton Arms merchant, made a huge fortune there. And of course, some of you will be familiar with the Curfew Tower in the centre of Cushendall and one of the arches, Red Bay, on the Antrim Coast Road, both of which were put in by Francis Turley using money that he gained in the East India Company when he was based in Canton, because Canton was the only location where the Chinese allowed the British traders to do their business. And of course, the British East India Company was rather short of products to sell to the Chinese. Chinese tea was hugely valued in Britain. At one stage, as much as 10% of the whole British government's revenue came from customs tax on tea imported from China into Britain. So the East India Company hit upon the idea of exporting opium. There had been native opium grown in China, but the Indian Bengal opium was a higher quality. And so there was sadly swiftly a take-up in the market for it. In 1837, 1838, the Chinese emperor and the viceroy in Canton decided that they did not wish to see their population enfeebled by British Indian opium, and so they wrote to Queen Victoria saying, please take it away, and having nothing more to do with it. We do not want it here. And sadly, the British government did not listen to those remonstrances, and we went to war, the first Opium War. And by this stage, the superintendent at Canton was none other than Henry Pottinger, a Belfast man, who'd served first in India. And it was Pottinger who decided in 1842 that he would seize Hong Kong Island as a trading port, and in particular a safe harbour. It means fragrant harbour in Chinese Hong Kong. And it was a lovely location when I was living there in the 1980s, and indeed still is. As a result of that Opium War, the British gained trading rights to a total of 5 ports along the coast, up to Shanghai in the north, Canton in the south, and Amoy, Foochow, and Ningbo along the way. Along with trading rights went a need for British consular representation. So this was the start of the British consular service in China in the 1840s, and Hart was, if you like, one of the sort of next generation of the initial young men who'd gone out there to be recruited. I mentioned that Bowring set a stock on having learning the Chinese language. In 1854, there were precisely 3 expatriate Britons in Hong Kong who could speak Chinese, let alone write it. So there really was a need for this. Hart was posted to Ningbo, and fascinatingly, he, on his way there, he was attacked by a pirate vessel, none other than the Shamrock, that he had been on that journey when he was going to school in Taunton, but they escaped, and he arrived in Ningbo. He found himself very lonely, and one of the constant refrains of particularly the consular service and the young men who served out there without wives or even with wives subsequently was their loneliness and the huge need for resilience, and the fact that the expatriate communities were very small. In Ningbo, there were no more than 20 foreigners, mostly missionaries, 1 or 2 women, but mostly men on their own. And that's a temple very similar to the Gunyam temples, for example, that I would have known in Hong Kong at the time I was there. David kindly referred to images in the book. We've included over 300. I'm fascinated by the many photographs taken by John Thompson, who was a Scot in 1870, 1871. Extraordinarily good quality, black and white, obviously, but I wanted to take the opportunity to bring them to a wider audience. So that's a temple that Hart would certainly have known and visited. But he was lonely. Hart kept a diary, started in 1854 when he first arrived out there. He didn't think an awful lot of Hong Kong as a location initially, and he thought rather less of Ningbo. But it could be as early as the following summer that he met a young woman. That's a charming photograph by John Thompson, not of IU, the young lady who taught him the local dialect and other things besides, but it's a boat girl on the southeast coast of China, very similar to, I think, how IU would have looked. That's Thompson again, about 1870. Hart talks to an extent in his diary about his relationship with Ayu, but critically not for 3 years or so. There is a gap, sadly, from later in 1855 through to 58, 59. He had the wit to destroy those 3 volumes of his diary, unlike the young Dufferin and another, but that's another story. He didn't. He merely crossed out the name of the young lady with whom he had a dalliance in the Mediterranean, and we can still read it because he didn't redact it as effectively as he should have done. But I digress. Robert Hart had 3 children with Ayu. Anna, a daughter, was born first, as you can see, in late 1858 or early 59, and then there were 2 boys born subsequently. And Hart wrote later in 1866, before he married, the connection was dissolved and Ayu presented with significant sum of $3,000 when she surrendered her children to my agent and herself married a Chinaman. The children were sent to England. It was arranged that my lawyer should take charge of them. I trusted them with £6,000 for their benefit. £6,000, a lot of money in 1866, an awful lot of money. So one thinks of his morality in terms of his relationship. He was generous in making financial provision for them, and we'll come back to them a little bit later on. That's a photograph by John Thompson of Macau in 1870. That's where Ayu was sent. And when I was living in Hong Kong, I used to love getting away to Macau for weekends. It was a Portuguese enclave going back to the 17th century and very attractive Portuguese architecture, largely untouched since then because the wealth went into Hong Kong at that time. There was very little commercial success really in Macau. So it was a lovely place to go and visit, but not, I suspect, for Ayu. By this time, 1858, Hart had moved from Ningbo to Canton. He'd been posted, he'd become a supernumerary interpreter, so he gained his first step on the rung of the ladder in the consular service, and he moved to Canton. And this was one of his visitors, cousin Tom Edgar, who was obviously a relation on his mother's side, and there's a rather fascinating little piece in his diary recalling when sorry, I'm just going to read the quote if I may. On 1 September 1858 at Canton, Hart recorded, I said somewhat uncharitably, after dinner, who should come in but my cousin Tom Edgar of the Surprise? Looks terribly old, coarse and unpresentable. Chatted about old times, very cool sort of meeting. Gave him my bed for the night and slept in a chair. Next day he wrote again, funny, Tom Edgar went away today. Odd meeting of 2 cousins, 10,000 miles from home after a 4 years separation. And I think Edgar, he became chief engineer on the Audacious. He died subsequently. So I think he was a sort of senior non-commissioned officer in the Navy. So possibly a slight element of snobbery in Hart's reaction and the count there, but it helped to ease the loneliness, some of these connections. And remember that it would take a minimum of 3 months to have an exchange of correspondence home. The Suez Canal was not open this time. Hart would write home. It would take, say, 6 weeks to get to Portadown or Hillsborough, and then another 6 weeks to come back out to, and the post would initially come to Hong Kong and then be forwarded in due course when there might be a vessel going to Canton or up the coast to Ningbo. This is what Robert Hart looked like in 1860. He's again beginning to progress here. He has taught himself good Chinese Mandarin. He can write it. He seems to have spoken it with a bit of an Ulster accent to the end, but nevertheless, he did well. He was taught the classics, some of the classic texts by Confucius and others, which gave him an ability to converse with senior Manchu officials, which was very important, to credibility in their eyes. and he began to make contact in Canton, if you'll allow me. I'm going to stick, I think, for the most part, with the Wade Giles Romanization of Canton and Peking that I grew up with, if you'll permit me tonight. In the book, we've used the modern one, the Pinyin Romanization of Beijing and Guangzhou. And that's Robert Hart. I think looking a little sort of smug, a little pleased with himself there. It's obviously a studio portrait out in China, in Guangzhou. He had risen now in the Allied Commission, and Canton was one of the locations where there were beginning to be issues about the collection of customs. That is to say, the dues on foreign vessels, British, American, German, Norwegian, what have you, bringing trade into the ports, including opium, but also many other goods, and paying that into the central Chinese government. Traditionally, what happened was that the local superintendents of customs were appointed by the Manchus in Peking, and very often they would hold on to the money themselves rather than remitting it to Peking as they were expected to do so. So this left the central government short of funds. And so there began to be a system set up initially in Shanghai in the late 1850s of British consuls working alongside Chinese customs superintendents to help make sure that the money was safely collected and sent on to Peking. And of course, the Taiping rebels were active at this time. There were big Chinese armies needing to be funded by the central government, as well as indemnities to be paid. So it was important to the Chinese Qing dynasty that they got the customs revenue. So in a way, it was a win-win situation, if you like. And initially, the customs was headed by a man called Horatio Nelson Lay, who disgraced himself in the eyes of the Chinese in 1863 when he brought back a number of British gunboats to help tackle piracy at the request and agreement of the Chinese government. But he tried to insist on him being in charge of them with the British admiral, and that, not quite understandably, was too much for the Qing government. So Lay was sacked unceremoniously. Robert Hart, aged 28 in 1863, was invited to be head of the Chinese Maritime Customs Service, the Imperial Customs, a post which he kept for the next 45 years. And as I was touching on, this is a cartoon, a later cartoon, but you can see the customs revenue there, and it was very important that that was remitted to Beijing so that the central government could have access to the funds. Hart reflected in his diary in Ningbo on Chinese views of matrimony. The two quotations on the left-hand side of that slide are written by Robert Hart. As in all China, so Ningbo is a desire to get married and have children. It's not love that draws them into the noose, it is custom externally and desire for children that leads parents to betroth children, causes young people to wish for wives. It's interesting that Hart somewhat wryly, I think, adds, by the time a Chinese has reached 40 years of age, he may with propriety take a second wife. The two quotations on the right-hand side of the column are written by somebody else who you may not have heard of, but she had very interesting family connections, and that was Percy French's sister, Emily French, who went out to Ningbo 25 or so years later than Robert Hart in the early 1880s. She'd left the family home in Roscommon. She'd gone to train as a nurse in London. She then went out as a nurse to a missionary hospital in Ningbo, and she served there initially. She then met and married her husband, an Irish doctor working in Ningbo, Dr. Charles de Burgh Daly. And she, I think, was rather more reflective and perhaps accurate in her perceptions about the views of Chinese matrimony. A lot of Chinese women is far from enviable. The bride is taken to live with her husband's family, where she's completely under the control of her mother-in-law, who has the power to make her life happy or miserable. The reader will realize that married life is not made easy for women in any way, and their chances of happiness are not great. Despite these sort of precautionary tales, Hart clearly decided that he needed a wife. His boss, Meadows, the consul at Ningbo, did actually marry his Chinese mistress and considered her his wife, but Hart wanted to have a a wife from back home. So he wrote in his diary in spring 1864, he wished very much he had a wife, but I don't see how I'm to get such an appendage. Later in July the same year, he wrote, when thinking of matrimony, I see myself inclined to dwell more on its cares and troubles than on its pleasures. And indeed, I rather fear that there's something of a leitmotif in his relationship throughout his married life, as you will see. He came back in 1866, exactly 12 years since he first went out there. No return to Ireland or indeed Britain for the first 12 years. That's with his wider family. Again, a portrait, that studio portrait, clearly posed. This is Robert in the centre back here. There is his parents, Henry Hart, whom we saw before, and Anne Edgar there, looking somewhat fierce. This, I'm sure, leaning over rather loosely on the left, is his brother James Hart, younger brother by 10 years or so, who did join him in the Chinese Maritime Customs Service for a number of years. Robert Hart hoped that James would take over from him, but James was a bit of a scamp and too fond of the bottle, and sadly died of cirrhosis of the liver in Brighton, aged about 50 or so. There were 12 children all of the Harts. 8 survived through to adulthood. So, as many of you will know, the plot thickened that shortly before Hart accompanied the Chinese delegation in 1866 to London, his aunt Brady, that is to say, Henry's sister Catherine, who was married to Colour Sergeant John Brady, had sent him a photograph of Hester Breeden, the daughter of the Hart family's doctor. He wrote in his diary, she's a nice looking girl. That is not the photograph that Brady sent to him. Sadly, we don't have that any longer. It is a photograph in the possession of Queen's University, taken by a German photographer in the studio in Yokohama, because quite often for rest and recuperation, expatriates in China, certainly those in the northern East Coast, would go to Yokohama for holidays, get a change of climate and scenery. And I think that's really a very charming photograph. That is the home of Hester Breeden, Ballintaggart, the home of the Armagh Cider Company. And George Boyd very kindly, when I gave my last talk in Craigavon 3 or 4 years ago, drove me out to Ballintaggart. You go up the drive, and I must say the hairs stood on the back of my head. You're walking precisely in the footsteps of Robert Hart in the summer of 1866. Apart from the television area at the top, the house is completely unchanged since Hester and her mother and the late Dr. Alexander Breeden were living there in 1866. And it's probably this room on the right was the parlour where Hester so winningly played for Robert Hart the piano. He called to give his condolences to the doctor's widow. Hester and he struck a chord, and within a week he asked her if she could bring herself to be his cellmate and come out to China. She said yes. Clearly she was looking for adventure. After this very fast courtship, in his diaries we do have 7 letters from Robert to Hester Hesse, and you can read them for yourselves. I'm afraid I think he was rather economical with the truth. He clearly, frankly, couldn't bring himself to be totally honest and say that he'd had a mistress and that he had 3 living children, whom by now he had shipped to London, safely out of the way, so there wouldn't be an embarrassment to him and to Hester when they set up in Peking. My dear, I conceal nothing. I make no unnecessary revelations. Remember, Hesse, you are marrying me for the future. And up above, in the future, nothing will be done by me to pain my wife. Well, I'm afraid that's probably not true. I think Hesse did discover quite when about the relationship and the existence of the 3 children. It's an interesting perspective. This was a girl called Julia Grimani, who married Patrick Joseph Hughes and went out to serve in the 1870s in the Chinese Maritime Customs Service. The first summer in the East is very trying to a young wife. Her husband is probably occupied during a great part of the day. She misses her own people, her companions. Unless she's adaptable, is apt to degenerate into the bored, vapid person, spends all her time paying calls, dressing, supervising or tailor, or flirting. Again, we do have this written in a Let's diary by Hester Hart, about her reflections in 1872. So you can see the numbers of foreigners were still very small in Peking at that time. By now she'd been living out there for 6 years. She'd had one child still born, the first one sadly, and they were either in the diplomatic corps or the missionary societies. To be fair, she does say people get on well with each other, which is good. Walking is unpleasant. State of the roads is bad. Complaining about the potholes, nothing much changes. Riding and scribble exercise. Amateur theatricals are enjoyed by everyone. And the usual standard of topic in our country, the weather, is replaced by the language. And this is a lovely image of a mule cart, admittedly one mule on the shaft there, in the early 1920s, from a lady I knew in Bangor, whose father-in-law had served in the Chinese steam navigation in the early 1920s. That's very much the sort of vehicle that Hesse was complaining about when she talks about riding on the shaft being preferable to occupying the cart hired for the purpose. The Harts had a family of 3 eventually. Evelyn Evie was the oldest. This is Bruce, who was his, to an extent, pride and joy, his only son, and Nolly was born subsequently after they'd gone back again to England and the continent in 1878. Bruce and Hester accompanied Hart out. Evelyn actually went to a little school in Bray in County Wicklow, stayed behind as a young child. This is a Hart Garden party, lovely image in the Queen's collection. I love the sort of dog cart here, perfect little cart, but it's, you can see 2 goats are pulling it, and there's an Irish wolfhound perhaps there. Hart is almost certainly in the picture there somewhere. We think it's dated 18 October. So by this time, if that is right, Hester will have returned. Sorry, I think that's probably Robert Hart there. You would expect it might be that. And this gentleman here may not be dressed for it, but he either has been or is about to be playing tennis. He has a tennis racket in his hand. That's Hart with some customs colleagues in 1883, just to give you a feel for the style of dress and the nature of the customs service. And that's Hart in the centre there. This man here, I think with bushy beard, is Edward McKean, a Belfast colleague of his. Hart was always very keen on recognition. He was, I think, a little embarrassed about his antecedents. There was undoubtedly snobbery in the expatriate community. The diplomats considered themselves the elite. The consular service tended to think they were next in the pecking order, and then the customs service after that. In terms of remuneration, the customs were actually much better rewarded than the consular service. And because there were several of them at each port, they didn't suffer quite the same degree of loneliness, and fewer of them, frankly, died prematurely or turned to the bottle. Hart was terribly keen to get this recognition of election to the Athenaeum, a very swish London society, which still, I think, doesn't admit women. He didn't like to put himself forward for 15 years or so. There's correspondence between him and his London agent, because he feared he'd be blackballed by Thomas Wade, who was a British consular officer and subsequently British minister in Peking for quite a number of years. He and Wade initially got on well, and then they fell out. Wade, frankly, was both inefficient, but also he was rather more, not anti-Chinese, but approached them in a manner that Hart did not deem appropriate to getting the best way forward. But eventually, in 1889, his name was put forward. by Sir Rutherford Alcock, a subsequent British minister, and Stuart Randall, who was a member of Parliament with him as London agent, were in touch, and he was elected nem. con, as they say. Hart was acquiring significant funds by this stage. Hester had left earlier in 1882, possibly as early as April or so of that year, and she did not return to Peking for 24 years. Indeed, husband and wife did not meet again for that 24-year period. She was shortly due to come back out before then, but she didn't in practice. Correspondence, we don't have copies of the letters between Robert Hart and Hesse. We do, however, have all the letters from Hart to his London agent, James Duncan Campbell, in which there are many references to Hesse, and he would enclose attachments and enclosures to go on to her letters. Bruce was a disappointment to Robert intellectually. He went to Oxford University, scraped through his first year. Then he met a young lady called Caroline Gilson. Her father there, and this again is Queen's photograph, had been a superintendent in the P&O line out in Hong Kong. He then moved back to Brighton, and I think that Hesse had taken the children one summer to Brighton for a holiday, and perhaps it was natural that people with Hong Kong connections should meet up. Hart and Hesse were very concerned that this couple, the Gilson, were after Bruce for his money. And so what did Robert Hart do? Well, if your son, you think, should be doing his studies, should not be pursuing a young lady, and certainly should not be marrying her, you take him to court. So Hart writes to Campbell and says, please instruct Hutchins solemnly to raise a court case to make my son Bruce into a ward of court, thus preventing him from matrimony until the age of at least 21. As you might imagine, this caused a certain degree of bitterness between father and son. Bruce did eventually manage to graduate from Oxford, and the moment he was 21, what do you suppose he did? He married Caroline Gilson. And the nice outcome in that particular story is that Bruce and Caroline did come out to Peking fairly shortly after they were married, and Robert Hart was forced to concede that he'd been a bit of a twit, that Caroline was actually an excellent influence on his rather wayward son, stopped him drinking as much as he should do, kept him at his studies, and was a thoroughly good influence. So that was good news that came to a story there. We mentioned the Breeden family, and of course the person who'd had to give his consent to Hesse marrying Robert was her slightly older brother, Robert Breeden. This is Robert Hart in the middle of this group, and this is Robert Breeden here holding his hat on his lap. Breeden had been a medical doctor after his father, initially in the British Army for a couple of years. He then was invited by Robert Hart to join the Customs Service, and he rose fairly swiftly in its ranks, which caused a certain amount of chagrin to other members of the Customs who'd been serving loyally for years and felt that they were entitled to some of the plusher posts initially. For quite a long time, especially after James Hart had proved himself unfitted for the post, Robert actually hoped that Breeden would succeed him as the Inspector General, but unfortunately that was not to be. And a different man, Aglan, with whom he had family connections from his schooling days, did succeed Hart in 1911 eventually. But Breeden was clearly an important source of support to him, including during the time of the Boxer Rebellion. And some of you may know his a biography was written, published in the early 1920s by Robert Breeden's daughter, Juliet, and that's a photograph of her in fancy dress, showing some of the activities that they got up to, either in Shanghai or Tianjin. And it's very much a hagiography of Robert Hart. But it's a nice read for all that. Moving on from the Breeden family, I wanted to show you this image of Henry Edgar, which again comes from Queen's. Queen's have a lovely series of photographs of the family. If you look at the bottom, You can perhaps read that it's taken in the McGill studio in Belfast, very much posed. This is Henry Edgar Richard, the postmaster's son, who again joined the Customs Service directly. He did so in 1868 initially. He rose fairly swiftly. He had some fairly plum postings. His first posting was at Foochow, where he was until 1883. He was then posted to a northern location where, as I record in the book, one of his more curious commissions from Robert Hart was for him, this man, Henry Edgar, to send in a sealed container to Lady Hart in London 5 tiger, 6 leopard, 6 wolf, and 6 fox skins. And Henry Edgar subsequently served in Yantai, that's Chifu, which is a plum posting. And we'll come on to that in a moment, if I may. He subsequently was posted to Shaanxi, which is an inland posting on the Yangtze, before he resigned in 1901. And Hart's niece, who knew Edgar and his wife, said that he was very wealthy. He retired to Nice, and he claimed to have travelled around the world no less than 7 times. I think Edgar is a bit of a dilettante. There is a very sad story I talked once or twice about resilience, and I will touch on the unfortunate Colin Jameson, who was for a long time considered a rising star in the Customs Service. Hart quite favoured him, but his health clearly let him down in the 1880s. He was moved at his own request to Chifu, which, as I say, was climatically a very pleasant posting, sort of halfway up the coast between Hong Kong and Shanghai. And then tragically in 1889, Hart writes to Campbell that sadly Jameson had disappeared, and eventually the body was found on rocks by the sea and identified by the British consul at Yantai, missing Jameson's watch and ring. The subsequent inquest reached no substantive verdict on how he came to drown. I think it's probably pretty clear that Colin Jameson took his own life, sadly. He had been suffering, almost certainly, from clinical depression. He had issues, and almost certainly there was nothing more to it than that. However, I will quote excerpt from the North China Herald, which also reported in November 1889 that referred to the murder of Colin Jameson, the commissioner, who was attacked and drowned in mistake for Henry Edgar, his predecessor in the post, who had caused one of the office writers to lose face. And I think myself, the fact that Edgar then went on leave, that Edgar did not get any plum postings on his return, suggests to me that maybe Hart thought there was something in that, that Edgar had treated his staff perhaps not appropriately. Let's put it that way. There were, of course, many challenges for Hart and the Customs Service. As you'll be familiar, this is a French cartoon, 1898, and that preceded the Boxer Uprising in 1900, but it very much shows the foreign Western powers, including Japan on the right here, working out how best to cut up the Chinese cake, and the poor old emperor in the background saying, "Hold off, this is my country." Hart was interred, if you like, during the siege of the British legations in Peking. He bore it stoically, despite being 70 or so years old at this point. Many of the other customs officers volunteered, and they held out for nearly 3 months against intermittent attacks from the Boxers, with some support from the Chinese government for the Boxers, before they were eventually relieved from Tianjin. And there's lovely correspondence in the Queen's special collections from Hart's nephew Eva Price. That's the daughter of one of his Robert Hart's sisters, and she was always she wrote lovely letters. You can see bottom left-hand corner there. Dearest Uncle Robert, I got such a delightful surprise last night by receiving these from the land of Sinim. And this, you can see there, is a book cover, These from the Land of Sinim, the biblical title that Hart gave to the series of essays on how he believed we should approach China after the Boxer Rising, not to be seeking major reparations, not to cripple them financially, certainly not to break down the country into different fiefdoms, as it were, for Germany or Britain or whatever it may be, but to support the Chinese government to get re-established. And there are many quotations in These from the Land of Sinim, but this one I like in particular. This is one that Robert Hart wrote. The Manchu Mandarin Wen Xiang had told him as long ago as the 1860s, when Xiang was a member of the Songli Yamen, the cabinet committee that looked after the foreigners and dealt with the customs service, who said, "You are all too anxious to awake us and start us on a new road, and you will do it, but you will all regret it. Once awaking and started, we shall go fast and far, further than you think, much further than you want." Robert Hart concluded in 1901, his words are very true. Hart also wrote that the China of the year 2000 would be very different from the China of the year 1900. Hart left Peking for the last time in April 1908, and shortly before he did so, he had been joined by Ernest Nash Ensor as a very young recruit into the customs service. And this is the last family that I should be dealing with, coming very near the end of the presentation now. This is Ardress House that many of you will know. Lovely country house, not that far from Craigavon. This is a picture of the Nash family, and this right at the front somewhere, I think it's that one, is young Ernest, the youngest of 14. And the men who joined the customs service were not always younger sons. Occasionally there were even older sons, but in this case it certainly was the youngest son who went off in 1909. And this is a postcard sent home from Ernest Nash to his sister, his favourite sister. Nothing doing on streetcars, that being a reference, I presume, to the San Francisco streetcars, but it's a Chinese wheelbarrow, again a form of transport that the Harts had referred to way back. And I wrote it partly because he says in the back, this is 1909, "Give a move on, young woman, to get the writing habit. Do you think I'm going to waste precious moments during my Shanghai trips to write letters which are ignored? If so, take a warning right now. My address is Customs," or you can leave that out, I'm known here, Xinjiang, China. That's splendid. He was just right, Ernest Ensor, Xinjiang, China, and it would get to him. But the point I make really is about the loneliness of the next generation. Okay, the Suez Canal had opened, sail had given way to steam, and it didn't take as long as 3 months to get correspondence from one side of the planet round to the other. But there was still an awful lot of pressure on young men to adopt resilience and to keep themselves occupied. Ensor then came back in 1914 at his own expense after just 5 years. He joined Blacker's battalion in the Royal Irish Fusiliers. It's a picture of him with a Fusiliers uniform on as a lieutenant. Then CLC in the top right-hand corner there, that's the Chinese Labour Corps. Very interestingly, a number of Chinese customs service members of it, officers, joined the Chinese Labour Corps, which at least suggests that the British army had the wit to realize that their ability to speak and indeed to write, because they were well qualified, Chinese, did equip them well to serve in the Chinese Labour Corps. I'm always fascinated by Enser. Just before I leave that image of him, because he was invalided out in 1918. He certainly had pneumonia and other issues. And he was due to return to the army at that stage, but he was posted, fascinatingly, to the Irish Joint Labour Centre, 27th Company, Chinese Labour Corps, in none other than Newton Ards. And I've never really been able, despite talking to colleagues in the Newton Ards Historical Society, to get much more information about it. These joint labour corps were locations. This one, the one for the whole of Ireland, had been the Curragh, and then it shifted to Newton Ards in 1918. Obviously, it was a posting where people who'd been, say, in the Chinese Labour Corps, come home to rest and recuperation or to recover from injuries, were then attached to before they were expected to go back out to the front, had the war continued on past November 1918. Interestingly, Hans van der Ven, with whom I'm in touch, Cambridge professor, who's written about the Customs Service, talks about Nash's, Enser's stellar career, and he became the commissioner at Wuhu in 1930, and that's just a nice image, rather older than that probably, of the commissioner's house with great style, the veranda there, the bamboo furniture, wicker furniture sitting out there, the beautifully tended garden, the parasol, in 1930. And his last post, fascinatingly, he came back and had correspondence with the then Inspector General, who was Frederick W. Mays, who himself was a nephew of Robert Hart. And Enser asked Mays for permission to retire with his superannuation benefits, as he had 3 children, none of whom were likely to be self-supporting. But Mays refused to allow him to retire at that time. So he actually served as the London representative in Queen Anne's Gate for some time after that. And I finished the story by saying that my wife and has a sister, and her sister has a godmother, and that lady was Enid Foster Hall. And when I and my wife were courting, we called on Enid Foster Hall in her London flat in 1979 or so. And I think we met her brother, Dick Foster Hall, who was the last London representative after Ernest Nash Enser, who wrote a small but fairly definitive history of the Chinese Maritime Customs Service in the early 1950s. So it's nice to think that that sort of personal connection, that I met or knew the last London representative, and that I quite by chance happened to acquire that wonderful painting of Hong Kong in 1854, which is precisely what Robert Hart saw when he arrived in Hong Kong. And on that note, if I may, David, I shall close the presentation and hand back to yourself.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Robin. Can you all hear me okay there? Sorry, I'm just a gap there. Okay, there we go. Thank you very much, Robin, for that. I'm just actually curious. What were you doing in Hong Kong? What was your role in Hong Kong?
I joined the working for Her Majesty's government, first in London, then in Belfast. And after 7 years, Belfast probably needed a break from me, and I needed a break. And fascinatingly, the Hong Kong government actually were advertising a couple of roles in sort of middle management level. That obviously they were training Chinese staff for coming through the system, but they just had a couple of vacancies, and I was lucky enough to get one in Home Affairs and Information branch, which was a fascinating time to be out there. And I helped to draft the first green paper on local democracy in Hong Kong in 1980.
When you were there, did you have much knowledge about Robert Hart or any of those sorts of figures from Ireland?
To be honest, no, it's an interesting point. Hart would have been very, very little known about at that time there. I mean, I did pick up, there were one or two people who did, yes, start my very embryonic interest in him, and indeed a colleague in Belfast I met subsequently, which was interesting. David Costello, of course, is still, I think, just the Irish Consul General in Hong Kong, and he's been very keen to help promote the interests and knowledge of the many Irish administrators in Hong Kong. 7 of the first 10 governors of Hong Kong were Irish, extraordinarily, and many, many others were too. And indeed, one of my frustrations, David, going off to slight tangent, is that I called it Downpatrick, the Down Cathedral, and there's a connection there with a member of the family of William Johnson of Ballykilbegs, who, if you remember your Irish history from the 1860s, who led the procession from Newtonards to Bangor, contravening the government's banning of public processions, basically an Orange March, as the British government would have seen it. And one of Johnston's sons, Lewis Audley Johnston, went to Hong Kong and had a distinguished career as the Postmaster General there. And I've always wondered, did he deliberately get away from his dad and go about as far away as he could in order to have nothing to do with Orangism in the Downpatrick area? But maybe I'm reading too much into it. The family never got back to me, sadly, on that.
Well, we'll leave that out there for people to make their own conclusions. If anybody has any questions, feel free to turn your camera on, or you can type into the wee chat box there. There's just George Riddle. Yes, Robin, would you be able to explain where you could purchase his book, or your book, and is it available as a hardback?
No, we've gone, to answer the second part first, we've gone just for paperback, but it's very good quality paperback. And it's certainly easily available online. It is available, should be in Waterstones in Belfast. If you just put into Google or any other search engine, the world administered by Irishmen, it does come up. I also said to David that, it retails for £20. If anybody would like to come to me through David and give me your address, I'd be very happy to send you a copy for £20, including postage, as it were. In other words, something of a reduction to get, because I've got a few copies here, and it's easy enough for me to get to local post office and pop a copy in the post to you. I might add also that this is really quite a short book. It's probably the longest one I've yet produced on history in Ireland. But there is a longer version, twice as long, 250,000 words, which was the initial draft that I produced. And Queen's University will be providing that as a digital edition sometime later in 2024, because we've done so much extra research. We just wanted to share that and make it available to anyone with an interest in Robert Hart online, whether from in Ireland or overseas. So that will be available.
Thank you. And that's Robin, that's clocking in at 268 pages, for a short book. That's a lot longer than most of our books.
Well, it's all the images that it's fascinating. I'm fascinated to read Laura's message in the chat there about having a Hart connection from the Lurgan area.
Oh, yes, great.
Very interesting. In terms of the direct line of descent, Laura, Robert had the one son, Bruce. He in turn had a son called Robin, or Robert, who sadly predeceased Bruce. For all that Bruce had health issues, nevertheless, he did live quite a long life, really in the London office, because his health wasn't up to serving for long periods in the Far East, unlike his father. And so the direct male descendants died out. There are, however, descendants from one of the sons of Ayu who went to Canada. Both the boys went to Canada for a while and then came back. Sadly, Anna died in her late 20s in London. She'd been sent by Hart to Switzerland finishing school. So he did look after them to an extent. And one of the sons is recorded in the 1911 census as an architect. So he had abilities. And that was what, and of course, there are many members of Hart families. I had the pleasure of knowing connections through the other Hart with an E on it, and Wesley Guard, and that connection, Wesley Guard having initially married one of Robert's sisters.
No, funny, I was going to ask you about the descendants of IU there. Was there still a line existing?
Yeah. Well, it'd be lovely to try to keep in contact with Laura and see if we can establish any connections there, because it would be likely to be so. I mean, it's not an exceptional name, is it, David? But I mean, it's comparatively unusual, even in the sort of Lurgan area.
Well, maybe David can help me in June. I will be in Lurgan in June.
Very good.
Great.
Yeah.
We'll talk to you about it later.
Yeah. Well, I'll keep a look at those connections, and then make sure you let us know when you're here. Okay, there's Claire Bustard. Yeah. Sorry, Laura. Yeah.
Oh, yes, thank you, Claire. I had a lovely visit to the Hart Memorial School. I gave the principal a copy of the book, and my wife and I called there in August, I think, last year when we were living, and we were taken along to the P7 class, and I was asked to sing for my supper and asked to talk to them for a couple of minutes about Robert Hart, because of course every year they do a project on Robert Hart. And I was talking to David. I'm hoping that maybe we can persuade him to be kind enough to go along in February and perhaps give them a little talk from his expert knowledge. But fascinatingly, the pupils in P7 were really well informed, and we touched on this issue of nepotism. I wasn't sure whether they'd be familiar with the term, and the fact that Robert Hart did have 8 members of his family did come out there, and of course Frederick Mays, one of his sisters married into the Mays family, became an Inspector General subsequently in the late 1920s through to the 1940s. And one of the boys put his hand up and said, "No, it's not really an issue, because if you know your relatives, you can trust them." And I think that's very shrewd. And what's more fascinating, the Chinese would have understood it. They would not have seen that as an issue. Chinese have the concept of guangxi, which is about relations, people you've grown up with, and business partners are the people that you have particular ties to. So I think I think sometimes we're a little sort of apologetically embarrassed about nepotism. No, I'm sorry to hear Julie retired, because she very kindly hosted us. Had a lovely discussion about animal welfare with her too.
Just picking up on, you sort of had a quote there from that book Robert Hart published, These from the Land of Sinan.
Yes.
Where he's talking about China being very different in 100 years from when he was writing. How's Robert Hart viewed today in China? Obviously it's not a great period in Chinese history, from a Chinese viewpoint.
Yes. Well, if I may modestly, I made so bold as to send a copy of the book to Lord Bew, Paul Bew, who I would have known a little bit through my working career in Northern Ireland, knowing that his son John is the Foreign Affairs Advisor to the Prime Minister. And I just felt it's so important that British policymakers understand that period of Chinese history. And the century of national humiliation, as the Chinese would call it, is such a fundamental part of their thinking to this day. And it's a bit frustrating, because I would have liked to have worked in partnership possibly with a Chinese academic on Hart. There are many papers out there in Nanjing to this day. And I did try to reach out, and it didn't seem to be particularly welcomed. So I think just at present, Hart is seen very much as, although he worked for the Chinese government, not for the British government, and quite often he would be critical of the British government's approaches in China. I think he'd be tagged with a sort of imperialist perception as well. And perception is so important, as we all know, sadly.
Yeah, probably. And there's David has just posted.
Yes, thank you, David. Yes, I was aware of that book. Have I actually read it? I'm not sure. That's a good question, but that may be something for Laura as well with the Hart family.
Yeah.
Craigavon there.
All right. Is there any other questions? And we'll bring everything to a conclusion. Okie dokie. Well, Robin, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate you, taking the time, and it was good to get an insight into your book, and of course, there's a lot more information in it. Can you hear me? Oh. Oh. Sorry. Oh. All right. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. No, sorry. I thought my microphone my microphone sort of went off there, but yeah, at least I was at the end. Yes, John, I think a summer trip to China would be a good thing for the next historical study outing. So, but Robin, thank you very much for taking the time to join us, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Just to let you know, our next talk will be on Tuesday, the 13th of February, and it will be on the local connections to the fight at the OK Corral. So we're sort of coming in your direction, Laura, for that. So we are, and I'll send out a link to the recording as well if anyone would like to revisit it. And yeah, thank you very much. Have a good evening, everyone, and we'll see you soon.